We present episode 2 of Cottoning On by Geoffrey Banks, read by Nigel Banks. In this episode we hear about young Geoffrey's move to a new school and house, the arrival of his grandfather to live under the same roof, and childhood pranks with his friend Harold.
What is the meaning of Empire Day? Why do the cannons roar? Why does the cry, "God save the King," echo from shore to shore? This is what the whole school gathered in the hall to sing every year on May 25th. In actual fact, the only roar you ever got to hear in Bolton was when the Wanderers scored. I heard it frequently because my grandparents lived less than a mile from Burndon Park. In the 20s, Bolton won the FA Cup 3 times, which gave their supporters a lot of practice at roaring. On Empire Day, you heard sod all. Yet in one respect, that song was memorable. It was my very first encounter with poetical license. Not that I knew it at the time. On balance, though, Empire Day was an attractive deal for schoolchildren, because, in return for belting out a few patriotic ditties, we got the afternoon off. The service included a song for each of the 4 elements of the British Isles, as they were then known. But how we dared sing one for Ireland defies belief. Nevertheless, there we all stood, applying our local accent to those lovely, desolate words. "The harp that once through Tara's halls its soul of beauty shed." Our understanding of the text was less than perfect, but nobody ever asked questions, even about the beauty shed, because we didn't want to prolong the ceremony. I did go home, however, and ask about harps, because I knew nothing about them. In a brass band region like ours, they were thin on the ground. Information about harps duly dribbled in from family, along with 1 or 2 illustrations featuring the heavenly host. Uncle Eric showed me the one on the label of a bottle of Guinness. And so, when I heard the news that we were to move house yet again, but this time to Harper's Lane, it was less of a shock. In one sense, the ground had already been prepared. The place had musical appeal. It occurs to me now that it was an apt address for the highly strung. The lane had 3 distinct sections, the first of which was merely a steep alleyway with cobblestones, but no houses, climbing between 2 high stone walls. The second section was much broader, but also cobbled, and with houses on either side. It went on climbing up to where the old stone house with outbuildings stood on the left. Half a dozen hens pecked in the yard, and the same number of cows occupied one of the sheds. It will come as no surprise to learn that this setup was known to one and all as the farm. And yet, its mere presence on Harper's Lane was enough to persuade me that now I lived in the country. When I was sent there with 3pence to get the accumulators for the radio set recharged, I got my first whiff of the byre. I was so intrigued by the sight of Tom's large grimy hands manipulating the cow's teats, that whenever my parents referred to him as the cowhand, I thought I really did know why. Sometimes Tom gave me a taste of the milk as soon as it reached the bucket. So creamy, so warm, such a danger to public health. Tom's boss, Farmer Clegg, had a weather-beaten face, and so, oddly enough, had his 2 sisters. Father once said they looked as if they did occasional outdoor jobs for their brother, but since one was a nurse and the other taught the piano, he hoped that they both washed their hands. Where our new house stood, halfway up that steep second section, young trees had been planted at intervals along the opposite pavement. As our house was the last of 6, we had the benefit alongside us of an open area of rough grass and weeds, known bluntly as the field, or on specific occasions, that field, as in, "What have I told you about kicking dog dirt around on that field?" It was actually more fun than trying to play serious cricket on it. The only possible pitch was a narrow line trodden flat over the years by passing cats and dogs. However, my father, who had played for his college, was anxious to pass on his skills to the next generation, me and my new friend Harold. Even at the age of 8, Harold was a natural droll, and to watch father shape up to Harold's bowling with his classic copybook batting stance was bliss. Harold had just two types of delivery: an absolutely steepling lob. While the ball was airborne, he would pretend to retie his shoelace, and the other type which threatened to smash his own toe cap. But with great cunning, he did not necessarily bowl them in that order. He was unplayable. Eventually father would surrender the bat and leave us to our ignorance. "There's no point in playing cricket," he would tell me later, "with a buffoon like that." It was on the flattish third section of the lane that I began to play marbles on the way to and from my new school. It was nothing like the official version of the game. We merely rolled them along in the gutter until one of us scored a hit. But it brought home to me the fact that, in games of chance, somebody has to lose his stake. Every time the other fellow clobbered one of my attractively coloured glass spheres, it became his property. It ceased to be mine. And since I spent much more time gloating over my collection than actually playing, each loss was very personal. The question that bedevilled me was never, "Will I win?" but rather, "When the game is over, will I still be in possession of all my marbles?" Now, at the age of 70, I'm still asking. At its junction with Church Road, Harper's Lane was quite impressive. It became much wider, and at the last moment divided to make room for a small island occupied by an elegant street lamp. There was a circular bench round the lamp, where people sometimes sat as they waited for the tram. From the circular bench, it was now only 200 yards along Church Road to my new school. As it was a main road, we actually looked up from our marbles now and then to check on traffic, but it was very light. Each vehicle made its own distinctive sort of noise as it approached, especially the horse-drawn carts with their clip-clop of hooves and the grinding of their iron-hooped wheels. Trams were audible while still out of sight, which gave sprinting members of the public a fair chance, and marble players reasonable warning. We certainly looked up when Norman Isherwood arrived that time. He lived further away and often came to school by tram, but on this occasion he tried to get off without paying his fare, and when the conductor grabbed at his arm, Norman fell badly, with one leg under the vehicle. It had to be amputated, below the knee. Later, there came a time when the classroom sound of 50 pens industriously writing was underscored by the gentle squeak of Norman's new leg whenever he needed to move it. He still liked to go swimming with us at Moss Street public baths, but of course he had to jump into the water without it. We all wondered how he could still swim straight, but none of us liked to ask. The tram route was peculiar in two ways. It had a lot of right-angled turns, and it was single track. To pass each other, opposite-bound trams had to meet on one of the loop lines which had been installed at lengthy intervals, and if one tram was late, passengers aboard the other did a lot of hanging about. The tram route terminus was just a short distance past the school, near the church which gives the road its name. At that time, where the tram track stopped, so did the corporation's concern for the road service. From that point on, it was cinders all the way. There were many cindered areas around then, which at least brought a touch of variety to the injuries we suffered. My Aunt Nora's fingernails were particularly adept at making extractions from what she called, knees like Eccles cakes again. But I was settling into the new home on Harper's Lane and my new school on Church Road with unexpected ease. Until the wind changed. One day, there appeared on our doorstep my Grandpa Tomlins, with luggage. No prior consultation. A Victorian King Lear exercising a paternal right. "But why, Grandpa? Why have you come to live with us?" "Because the tram's past the market." "He's an old masher. Always was. Always will be." I knew they were talking about Grandpa Tomlins, and I was puzzled. A masher? I'd never seen him anywhere near the kitchen. "What's a masher?" "Never you mind. Little pigs have big ears." It was years before I found out that masher was turn-of-the-century slang for a natty dresser, and what's more, a man with a roving eye. Grandpa certainly stood out from the rest of the family as far as wardrobe was concerned. As long as there were suitable flowers in the garden, he would pause there to decorate his buttonhole before setting off to work in his Homburg hat, morning coat, striped trousers, spats and cravat. He must have had a fair old idea of himself as he paraded along the avenue, raising his hat to the ladies or the tip of his walking stick to salute the men. I suppose he brought his sense of style with him when he migrated to the north from London. He came in answer to an advertisement. He had a successful interview and was appointed manager of an old established tailoring business, a stone's throw from the town hall. Since his arrival, he had picked up a number of northern expressions which he threaded into the conversation, possibly to oil the wheels with customers and fellow businessmen. As soon as my ears became attuned to such things, I saw that these phrases might well be authentic, but that his version of the accent was not. He was still an off-comer, really. He believed that children were there to be seen but not heard. Whenever I got carried away by some tale that I'd embarked on, he would put the brakes on me by calling out, "Thou tell's a bonny tale, lad. Can thou sing and all?" Then, if I persisted, he'd finish me off with, "Happen so, but that'll crack no flags in Accrington." With me in tow, my mother often dropped in to see him midweek at his shop, and sometimes an assistant would apologise for his absence. He's out at the barber's," we were told. "But we expect him any minute now." It was said with a bright smile, but also an underlying jumpiness, which went up a couple of notches when Grandpa strode in. His Kaiser Bill moustache was newly waxed and pointed, ready for action. But the sight of Mother and me deflected him from his usual targets. So we became quite popular down there. We reprieved the staff whenever he hustled us into his office, which soon reverberated with the aroma of the bay rum that the barber squirted on his hair. Like other businessmen of the day, Grandpa went to the barber's, first and foremost, to get a professional shave, which was rightly or wrongly held to be the mark of a gentleman. Almost as important was the conversation. The barber's shop was as good as a club when it came to trade gossip or rumours from the stock exchange. Something which Grandpa heard there, or perhaps at his Masonic lodge, prompted him to invest the bulk of his savings in a dodgy venture, which came to grief. He lost the lot. By the time he arrived on our doorstep at Harper's Lane, life had cut him down to size. Retirement had deprived him of the business status which he'd so enjoyed. In addition, he had lost his wife through cancer, his money through speculation, and finally his home. The decision to sell the family house near Burnton Park and move into a small semi had been sound enough. Unfortunately, he went halves in the transaction with his youngest daughter, my Aunt Lizzie Jane. She was still unmarried at 35, but from her girlhood on, her undue interest in the opposite sex had infuriated her father. Ironically, she was the daughter he deserved, but the rules were very one-sided then. Mashers were condoned, often enough with sneaking admiration, whereas a woman of Lizzie Jane's inclinations was no better than she ought to be. The final straw was Grandpa's discovery that she had begun a liaison with her boss, and that the latter was a married man. When she refused to give him up, Grandpa packed his bags. His physical presence at Harper's Lane lasted 5 years, causing me to be evicted from my own bedroom and relegated to another, already occupied by my father's spinster sister, Nora, who'd fallen on hard times. Far more upsetting for me, however, was the slow realization that Lizzie Jane, my favourite relative, was about to disappear from my life. Cut off, persona non grata, never to be spoken of again. Grandpa's special armchair was duly delivered, and awarded the prime spot in the living room, which at once appeared to shrink. My friend Harold and I did a lot of playing at carpet level in those days, which meant that the old gentleman's legs absorbed regular collisions. He was also an unintended target for the various missiles we launched. There was giggling when a paper aeroplane whizzed off course right past his ear, or a balloon landed on his open library book. If he decided the armchair had become untenable, he would stalk from the room, turning in the doorway to deliver some baffled parting shot like, "And pull your stockings up, you ragamuffins!" When my schooling reached homework stage, I found his restlessness a distraction. For reasons of economy, the rest of the house was unheated, except on Sundays, and there was no escape from his frustrated pacing to and fro between the window and the sideboard, and the perpetual jingling of the coins in his trouser pockets. Moreover, as I worked at the table, he tidied things away, all round me. Ironically, I have inherited his orderliness, and am doomed like him to straighten ornaments and picture frames until I drop. He would go so far as to pick up a sheet of writing paper from the floor and chuck it on the fire, without checking that it was in fact his grandson's arithmetic. When Grandpa came to live with us, he was 67 and had a dodgy heart. And yet I have learnt from a family source that, while under the same roof as Aunt Nora, he made regular advances to her, to the point of serious harassment. She was quite uninterested in having a relationship with anybody, least of all with him, because he made her flesh creep. That he finally offered her marriage was the measure of the old gentleman's desperation, and the power of his libido. We boys knew nothing of this. To us he was simply the enemy. In one of the comics we used to read, there was a dastardly villain known as the White Cobra. Although there was really nothing about Grandpa Tomlins which could fairly be described as snake-like, that was the nickname we bestowed on him. And with especially low cunning, we never uttered it aloud except in French. "I wonder if Cobra Blanc will be going to the park this afternoon," one of us would say suggestively, under another helpful volley of balloons. It wasn't simply that we wanted him out of the way, either. Our machinations were more diabolical than that. It had not escaped our beady little eyes that, at the fork in my grandpa's trousers, there was a bulge of preternatural proportions. Since our sexuality had now begun to assert itself, we imagined that this swelling was evidence of the man's grave moral delinquency, and well worth a spot of surveillance on our part. Weather permitting, Grandpa did stroll along to the park on certain days, and there, after a short tour of inspection, would sit down on a bench in the rock garden and read his library book. For a couple of hours, Harold and I would maintain vigil from the shrubbery nearby. We actually brought field glasses with us, and took turns at training them keenly upon the old gentleman and his trousered excrescence. Who can say what our ignorant expectations were? Did we think it might levitate? Or better still, explode? It did neither. It never moved. One day, as Harold and I paused at his front gate for our usual natter before separating for lunch, his father came out of the house to speak to me. "Your mum called round earlier," he told me, "to ask if you could have your meal with us today. The thing is, old son, your grandfather's just died." He was looking at me quite expectantly, too, I remember. But it was all right. I wasn't about to faint or dissolve in floods of tears. What I felt was a kind of emotional cocktail. First, there was an unmistakable thrill of sheer interest. There was guilt, too, in the involuntary flicker of my eyes towards Harold. There was a touch of calculation also at the possibility of a room to myself once more. And disappointment, was there? Oh, yes, indeed. My grandpa's trousers were off the hook now, so to speak. Back at school for the afternoon, I found enough to occupy me fully and to erase the thought of Grandpa's passing from my mind. Only when I was homeward bound did I remember. As I dismounted at the gate, I saw my mother's face at the window. Her eyes were red. She told me with fresh tears that the undertaker was expected any moment, but that there was still time for me to pay my respects. Overriding my fearfulness, she took me by the hand and led me to the little front bedroom where my grandfather had died. For the benefit of the undertaker, he had been laid out on top of the bedclothes in a nice clean nightshirt. I was scared, all right, at the start. He was my first, and I'd no idea what to expect. It was a big relief to see that his disapproving eyes were shut. In fact, apart from that funny colour, he looked much as ever. All the same, he evidently wasn't going to get up and do anything spectacular, so my interest began to wane. My mother had stooped over him to kiss his forehead and was now murmuring endearments to his unresponsive face. While she was thus preoccupied, my gaze slid irresistibly, guiltily, lower. It was no good. The white cobra had taken his guilty secret to the grave. Years later, hunting for something in a cupboard full of odds and ends, I came across a bulky package which I hadn't seen before. When I showed it to my father, he said, "Good grief, your mother must have kept it all this time." And lowering his voice, "That's Grandpa Tomlins' truss. He had the most appalling hernia, you know." At meals, throughout my grandfather's time at Harper's Lane, he sat automatically at the head of the table. But as far as my father was concerned, that was no big deal. In this, as in all else, Dad raised temperamental undemonstrativeness to the level of art. For instance, he never once referred to the horrors of the trenches in 1914, only to the lighter moments of his war. Like the time when an unimaginative adjutant caused a notice to be pinned up in the mess with the heading FARTS. The hilarity which this produced amongst the ranks went on renewing itself in huge waves, and my father never forgot it. Neither did the adjutant, whose future notices were addressed in full to the 1st Army Rifle Training School. At one stage of the war, a call went out from GHQ for volunteers with experience, however slight, of teaching. My father had joined up straight after college, but having completed all the practical aspects of his teacher training, he was considered acceptable and withdrawn from the front line to undergo a thorough course in musketry. His eventual promotion to the rank of Staff Sergeant Instructor with the farts very probably saved his life. He said it was the wind of change. His only injury throughout 4 years in Flanders was the scratch he received during a bayonet practice. It turned septic and nearly cost him his arm. But after that, he had no call to visit a hospital for the next 60 years. Dad was durable. In the first 30 years of his teaching career, legend had it, he was only once absent from work, and for only half a day at that. Could it have been on the occasion of his firstborn's birth, I asked him, when he had run across the fields at Dimple to get the doctor? Well, no, he admitted rather shyly. The Wanderers had a vital FA Cup replay one Wednesday afternoon. He did not enjoy the game at all, apparently. Just before the kick-off, he happened to turn round and found he was sitting within sacking distance of the Director of Education. Dad was durable, all right, but scared stiff of losing his job. He never played hooky again. His first teaching post while we were living at Dimple was almost a rural idyll. It was at Walmsley Village School, where there were only 2 classes in a single room, one taught by the headmaster and the other by my dad. They had to look out for the vicar, as it was a Church of England school, but also for a certain retired army colonel who saw himself as the local squire. This gentleman had a fair bit of land and often went out with a gun and his 2 retrievers. Then, if he suddenly felt the need to have a word with his headmaster, he would stride into the schoolroom and park himself in front of the stove with the 2 dogs at his feet. And whatever was in progress, he would brusquely interrupt with, "What are you going to do this year about Empire Day?" or some such. As a former NCO, my father was rather in awe of him, but on one occasion his love of sport compelled him to speak up. "This school," barked the colonel, "ought to have a proper football team. Cricket team, too, for that matter. What do you propose to do about it?" Father swallowed hard and said that if the owner of a certain idle field would allow the boys to practice on it, he would guarantee 2 creditable teams. The owner of the idle field gave my father a long, hard look, and so did his 2 retrievers. But he finally managed a nod and a wintry smile, and father had his wish. 20 years later, I was playing for my own school's cricket 11 at Bradford Grammar School, when their games master came into the pavilion, ran his eye over the names in our scorer's book and asked, "Which of you is Banks?" When I owned up, he said, "I hope your father is very well. Please give him my best wishes. I was in his first cricket and football teams at Walmsley School." Dad remembered him perfectly. "Good Lord, yes. H.D. Fairclough. He was a beautiful cutter of the ball," he told me. His father was the village butcher, you know. That rural idyll was a world away from his next situation at a big town centre school, which had more than its fair share of disadvantaged kids. Even so, and without a blade of grass in sight, Dad went on producing creditable teams which had to train on concrete. Whenever they had the misfortune to break a school window, a form had to be filled in for the education office by the caretaker, who was also a Wesleyan lay preacher, known to his flock as Brother Sharples. Whenever he filled in such forms, he always wrote down, "Cause of damage, act of God." At one period, Father was teaching 3 separate groups of boys in the same room. None of them was particularly bright, but the bottom group was so unintelligent, "dim as a Tock-H lamp" was his expression, that in the end he scrounged as many lengths of wood as he could from Brother Sharples, together with a good supply of nails, and the demise cheerfully set about knocking the nails into the wood, extracting them, and then knocking them back in again, all day, possibly. "Do they never make anything with the wood?" I once asked. "Good Lord, no," my father said. "Haven't time to show them, and if I did, they'd never follow it." Without being antisocial, my father was never the gregarious type. He was a very quiet, very private sort of person, who didn't seem to feel the need for friends. Instead, he had Harry Brickles. They met in the army, but were very different in temperament, and as they lived on opposite sides of Bolton, the attachment would probably not have survived without the bond which had grown up between their wives. Nevertheless, the Brickleses were very much a part of my world, as my adoptive uncle and aunt. In the summer of 1924, our 2 families shared a joint holiday at St Anne's-on-Sea in Rooms with Attendance, boarding house, care of Mrs Berryman. The 2 men packed us off by train and followed by bicycle. When they eventually arrived, they intrigued me by blowing out their cheeks and declaring they were punctured. Apparently I went round repeating it all day. Seaside holidays were not my father's style. He didn't care at all for the water, and on the beach made no further concession to the concept of leisure gear than removing his jacket and rolling up his shirt sleeves. Uncle Harry was even less adventurous. Highly self-conscious of the onset of his premature baldness, he never once removed his hat. His Trilby hat. He was also trying to save money by switching from cigarettes to a pipe, but lacking the constitution for it, he was often convulsed by massive hiccups, which I was forbidden to enjoy aloud. He did a lot of gobbing into the sand too, and then covering it up like a cat. In later years, my father opted out of holidays almost completely. He was never truly at ease if he couldn't see all the 4 corners of his property at once. To men like him, life is a permanent hurricane, in which they are the privileged ones who occupy the still centre, the eye of the storm. Each little sortie that they make strengthens their conviction that what they have at home is best, and they return rededicated and content. They know who they are. In the trenches, Dad had learnt to keep his head well down until the barrage stopped, and fairly well down between times too, in case of snipers, which made it much easier for him to survive Grandpa's occupation of Harper's Lane than for me, at a time when I was also learning to cope with my transfer to Church Road School. At 9:05 that first day, the yard was thronged as we threaded our way through to the main door, where my mother spoke to the teacher in charge. He was a tall man with spectacles, and I later discovered that his name was Nuttall. I was tempted to call him Norman, in memory of my little playmate of Florence Avenue. The rest of the school, however, for confectionery reasons, preferred to call him Minto. When he blew his whistle and the pupils raced to line up in front of him, I thought at once of the same procedure at Bank Top, which had yielded 3 lines of roughly 10 boys each. At Church Road, there was a whole regiment, And when they filed into the building and up the stairs, the metal studs in every boot or shoe made a most intimidating racket. The many shrill voices were trapped in the stairwell and rebounded cruelly from the green enamel paintwork and the half-tiled walls. It was like being rushed from a sleepy little cottage hospital to have major treatment at the town centre's Royal Infirmary. My condition must therefore be serious. Would I live?
Cottoning On by Geoffrey Banks, read by Nigel Banks. All music and studio recording by Robert Burgess. And this was an Old Dolly production.